We had as a big example Mary Meeker's internet trends, which for about 20 years in the United States was the go-to report in the technology sector. And we said, what if we build the internet trends for Latin America? Because no one's doing it. No one's telling the story.
Ana, Julio, thank you for being with me today. Welcome to the J Curve.
Thank you, Olga, for having us.
Thank you. I'm so excited. We talked about this back in New York, and I've seen so many of your videos, and it's so great to be here.
It's great to be here in Rio. First time in Rio. First time recording an episode with more than one person as a guest. So there are a lot of first time things. And main topic of the conversation will be Atlantico Report. That is mind blowing that you're releasing this week. And I'm super excited about that. But I really want to start with a little bit on you and talk about all your prior experiences that impacted where you are today. And we're going to start with Julio. So, Julia, what were the most formative experiences in your personal and professional life that impacted how you think as an investor and as an entrepreneur today?
Great. And before I go that, I think it's amazing that you've been to Brazil almost 30 times. And this is the first time you come to Rio. So I think we definitely have to change the ratio of those future trips. So I'll give you one example from my personal life and then one from my professional life. My personal life, I grew up moving every 3 years. My father was a diplomat, so I lived all over the world. And I think that having to encounter and sort of be forced with change throughout my life and having to see, I think, the positive side of change was something that really shaped my character and the way that I see the world. So when we think about technology in particular and investing in technology, technology is all about change, right? And you can either face change and see in it a threat or a challenge and try to resist it. And usually resistance is futile when it comes to innovation. Or you can embrace change and see it as an opportunity. And I think that entrepreneurs in the technology space, and I think the investors that back them, have to be very open to change and riding some of these big waves that we see when it comes to changing the world. The second thing I'd mention from my professional experience definitely has to be the first big company I started. It was a company called Peixe Urbano in the local services space here in Brazil in 2010. At the time, we were the fastest growing technology company and one of the largest in all of Latin America. And the experience there was very much a roller coaster ride. We went through a hyperscale phase of getting to over 1,000 employees. We were in 6 countries. We were doing over $100 million of revenue. And then fast forward almost a year after that, we're sort of on the brink of bankruptcy and having to turn around the company. And I think having gone through that entrepreneurial journey, both the highs and the lows, gave me a lot of empathy for what it's like to be an entrepreneur and for life in the trenches. It also, as an investor, gives me, I think, a different appreciation for what it's like to actually take what's on a PowerPoint deck or an Excel spreadsheet and make it into reality. That a lot of investors that have never been in the trenches don't really have that appreciation. And I think at the same time, don't have that empathy I mentioned for what it's like and how challenging it can be, both professionally, but also personally and emotionally for entrepreneurs that are going through this journey.
Was there any specific aha moment when you decided that you no longer want to be an operator and you want to turn to the investment side of the table? And if so, what was that moment or a group of moments?
After Peixe Urbano, I moved back to the US. I went to live in San Francisco and I started another company called Prefer, focused on the US market, which I ran for about 3 years, three and a half years there. And I think after these 2 experiences, which I think were both exhilarating but also exhausting, I felt like I had had my fair share of being a player on the field and trying to run companies. And I felt like it was time for me to stay in the game, but not as a player, but more of as a coach. And decided that being an investor was a great way to, I think, support the next generation of founders that were out there. I think really trying to have a big impact, but also putting my money where my mouth is. If I felt strongly about a particular idea or a particular team, I could basically support them financially as well as with my time and be able to be successful in that way, but still be part of that entrepreneurial journey, albeit on the back seat rather than on driver's seat.
Is it true that you have also started the first entrepreneurship podcast in Silicon Valley?
I don't know where you got that information, but it's roughly true. So I started a podcast on entrepreneurship and innovation in 2005. So you're going to ask me, what was a podcast like in 2005, given that there were no iPhones at that point, right? And the reason it's called a podcast is because of the iPod, the precursor to the iPhone. And all the podcasts were released through RSS on the web, and people would download it to their portable music player and listen to them. And I had not the first, but an early podcast on technology and entrepreneurship. It was called I Innovate. And we interviewed different guests in Silicon Valley that were building things that were interesting. We would go basically have a coffee with them and record that conversation and then edit it down. And that podcast actually grew to be one of the largest podcasts in business in the world. We were actually at one point ranked number one for technology and entrepreneurship in the world. Again, these were very different times. There were very few podcasts and very few listeners. But it goes to show that how if you go and do something, I think, passionately about a topic that you like, and you're really genuine about it, I think in the way that you've been able to show here with the J curve, that people want to listen.
I would also highly recommend watching the video of Julio interviewing Eric Schmidt. He's wearing a great Hawaiian shirt. It looks very early 2000s.
We'll definitely put the link to the Eric Schmidt interview in the show notes.
Please don't.
I'm so
As I was preparing for the interview, I looked at all the logos that Ana managed to achieve in such a young age, honestly. Forbes 30 under 30, top women in investments in Latin America in 2020, as per LAFCA. Founder at Brazil at Silicon Valley, which today is one of the largest, if not the largest conference that connects top Brazilian executives, entrepreneurs, venture capital investors to the global community. So what were your key motivations to get into tech and investing and content creation for that matter? And what are the key learnings out of that experiences that impact the way you operate today as an investor?
It's a very kind intro and a great question. So when I decided to start my undergrad studies at Stanford, I really thought that I was going to political science, into the public sector. My concentration was in economic development, was what I was really, really passionate about. And I think my aha moment for when I realized that my way to contribute to economic development was actually through innovation rather than being in the public sector. My first job was actually in New York. And that's when I had the aha moment. So my team was a 4-person team. It was mostly partnerships for infrastructure. This was back in 2017. And I don't know if you remember, there was a chaotic piece on the news about Amazon opening their second headquarters. So my team got shifted from kind of working in infrastructure, doing the pitch for New York for Amazon. Eventually we won, but after that, Amazon kind of pulled back, New York pulled back, and it never really went through. But my role in that was basically to map out the entire tech ecosystem in New York. And for those 2 months, I had an incredible time meeting a lot of different entrepreneurs and realizing how the impact that they were having in the ecosystem was actually bigger than what I was seeing in the public sector alone. So when I went back to Stanford, I was lucky enough to meet a lot of the people that you went to grad school with, to start Brazil at Silicon Valley. And that was my first kind of interaction with tech in Latin America. And if you remember, that was a time when so many investors were kind of becoming interested in the region. First IPOs, it was PagSeguro, it was Stone. You were seeing a huge capital inflow, which compared to 2021, it seemed small, but at the time, it just seemed crazy. It seemed like we were at the beginning of a very clear inflection point in Latin America. And that's when I made the decision that's what I wanted to work with.
So, Julia, what brought you back to Latin America and what made you bullish about the potential of tech in Latin America versus potential of tech elsewhere?
I moved back twice in my life. I moved back in 2010, and then I moved back again in 2019. First time as an entrepreneur, the second time to start Atlantico. The first time I moved back, give you a little bit of context, this was a decision made in 2009, cover of The Economist, Christ the Redeemer in Rio taking off, was Brazil takes off. Brazil was, I think, on all the major world headlines as sort of the future country of the world. And I had been living in the U.S. for about a decade at that point. I had moved to the U.S. initially to go to college. I went to Penn and then had stayed on for a while, gone to business school, and then worked for about 5 years in Silicon Valley. And I felt look, if there's ever a moment I'm going to go back home, this is it, right? I had this experience working in tech as a product manager in Silicon Valley. I felt like there was a huge opportunity for technology also to take off in Brazil, along with, I think, the rest of the economy. And I decided to pack up my bags and move back. And that's when I started Peixe Urbano. It was very much to ride that wave of change that I saw happening. I then, after the company I started in the United States didn't work out and we shut it down in 2019, it was very clear to me that the biggest opportunity as an investor for me was to come back to Brazil again. Because Ana alluded to before, I really felt like the region was at a huge inflection point. Starting there with 2018, 2019, I had been lucky enough to be a part of that, first as an entrepreneur, but also as an investor for that first 10-year run-up. And I felt like now was the opportunity to move back, thinking about the next 10 to 20 years and where I wanted to build my life. And I felt like being able to build what we're trying to do here at Atlantico, which is really to be the leading venture capital investor in the region, we felt like this was the right moment, the right time, and the right place. And that's how I decided to pull the trigger and move back.
Atlantico is not the first fund that you've started, am I right? It was Canary and Graph Ventures. And the team that you co-founded Canary with is partially involved in Atlantico and involved in LATAM digital report production as well. So what is your secret to building these high quality partnerships that you can scale across different domains that you operate in?
You're right. I've been investing for now over 10 years. Right? I started investing back in 2011, as you mentioned, with a group of 4 friends. We started Graph Ventures to invest in seed stage globally. I was the one that was more running point on Latin America. Then decided to double down on that Latin America strategy and start Canary back in 2017 with a group of local friends and co-investors. And then eventually kind of evolve that to Atlantico to really focus on classic early stage venture investing, more kind of Series A, post-product market fit investing. And I think that investing in entrepreneurship in general is very much people business. You are investing in talent, you're investing in vision, you're backing teams that you think can go out there and really change the world. And I think if you're going to do that, you also have to think about your own team and your ability to invest. And I've always cultivated friendships, is what I would say, first and foremost, with people that I respect, with people that I can learn from, and from people that I can have fun with. And a lot of those folks are people that have been my partners over the years and are my partners today. And I think that that approach of who are people you really want to be able to spend the next decade with, that are going to be fun, is going to be exciting to be with them. You're going to learn from each other. I think you're going to question each other and challenge each other's beliefs. That approach, rather than perhaps a more pragmatic, is I think what's led me to have these strong relationships and be able to attract people that I think have made great partners and be able to build a really complementary team.
How did your partnership come to be? What was that dynamic that led to you inviting Ana become a partner in Atlantico?
I'd love to hear that story from you, but I'll tell you how I met Julio, and then I'd love to hear it from you. So we met through Brazil, Silicon Valley. He was on the board of advisors, and at the time, he was just starting Atlantico. It was 2019, right? Early 2020. And you were looking for someone to do the first edition of the digital report. And I needed a job. And so I asked him, okay, we'll do this project together. I'm super excited about what you want to build at Atlantico. And I really was. I was super excited about the vision of what a venture fund, especially run by entrepreneurs like Julio, some of our other venture partners, could look like in Latin America. But I said, this is a 3-month project and I'm looking for a full-time job. And he said, well, I'm not hiring. But if you do a good job with the digital report, if we get along well, if this works out, I'll introduce you to a lot of people in the ecosystem and I'll kind of help you figure out the next step. So by the time that we were done with the 3 months in the digital report, we launched the 2020 report, which is incredible. We did it with a team of 4 people. It was hugely successful, more than we had anticipated. And there was so much to do at Atlantico. It was in the very beginning. I was really excited about moving into investing. I had dipped my toes in investing at Pear, it's a seed stage fund in Valley. And so we kept pushing that trial period by 2 months, every 2 months. So no, I'll stay another 2 months. Stay another 2 months and we'll figure it out. Then eventually Julie made me the full-time offer 6 months later, I think.
Yeah, I think that's roughly how I remember it. But I do remember like a very specific conversation we had where Ana said something like, well, I want this research experience that we were doing for the first digital report. I wanted to potentially go into a full-time job. I said, I'm not hiring. And she said, well, I want to have this conversation at the end of my period here. Kind of like, see what I can do and then we'll talk. And then that's
I
exactly what
remember that.
happened. So it was at the end of I think it was something like 3 months. I remember having a conversation with two of my other partners, Guilherme Teles, who had been the CEO of Uber here in Brazil and had worked with me at Peixe Urbano way back in the day, and Hugo Barra, who continues to be a very active partner and is probably one of the sort of preeminent Brazilians in the tech world. And I think the three of us sat on a call and we're just like, we have to hire this person. There's no way we can not hire her, even though we didn't have a position. So we basically made a position, brought her on board, and I think the rest is history.
So, Digital Reports, first edition 2020. Why did you think that it was the right timing to release a digital report? And why do you think it was even needed at that time?
So as I mentioned to you, when I moved back to Brazil, I felt like we were really at an inflection point when it came to growth of technology. And the more people I would tell that story that I had in my head, the more I could see things kind of clicking in their own head of understanding what was happening in the region. And this is predominantly for people outside of the region, outside of Latin America, that were trying to understand the region. I said, well, I really have to package this in some way to be able to show the world all the amazing things that are happening here and kind of really shine a spotlight on all the entrepreneurs and all the companies that are coming out of the region. And we felt like the best way to do it was to tell that story through data in a really objective manner, in a way that people could come to the conclusion for themselves. And we had as a big example, Mary Meeker's Internet Trends, which for about 20 years in the United States was the go-to report in the technology sector. And we said, what if we build the Internet Trends for Latin America? Because no one's doing it. No one's telling the story of these amazing people, these amazing companies that are happening here. And that's what we did. Let's try to tell through data the story of the inflection point, the opportunity that's ahead, to really be able to draw attention from international investors, from international entrepreneurs, talent that's abroad that maybe wants to come home, and be able to help give our little push to the region as far as this massive movement that we're having in technology.
It's really hard to argue with data. It's not subjective, right? It's not storytelling. You have this hard research numbers that are unbelievably impressive. I remember each time that I explained someone in the US that on average Brazilian spends close to 10 hours on the internet, and it's mobile first nation. Nobody really believes that. And then I said, oh, you know what? I actually have a report that backs all this. So let me share it with you. So I don't remember how big was the initial report, but last year report was 200 pages. So I really want to go into the nitty-gritty details of what it takes to create such a monument of work in terms of research, in terms of distribution, in terms of partnership ecosystem, because I know that you do a lot with partners, you engage MBA students from best business schools, you work together with a bunch of institutions and VC firms here. So how does that whole thing works in practice? And what changed since you released that first 2020 report to what it is today? And
So the first year, we didn't really know what we were going to do. So the entire process kind of started. So that team was me, one other intern at the time, one person who was part-time working with us and leading the report. And the four of us, we kind of just boiled the ocean first. So we gathered as much data as we could from public sources. Then we interviewed top executives and entrepreneurs in education, healthcare, and Fintech, which were the three topics that we decided to explore that year before we even started to think about the structure of the report. So because we needed to learn what were the most interesting things happening in the region, and the best way to learn that is through data and talking with people that are in the trenches, that whole process, I think, took us about a month and a half before we actually started to structure the report. And then what came out of that was our take on what was happening in the region. And the way that we chose healthcare, education, financial services was because those were the biggest drivers of both the economy, but also of social mobility and reducing inequality. So it took a lot of that, but I think it was much simpler back in 2020 than it is today. I think today we've really increased both the amount of data that we're able to gather, and in part of that, because of the brand that they're built, we've gotten a lot of partners from tech companies to researchers like Atlas Intel, and just so many people in the ecosystem that are willing to share private data with us that they've never shared before. And they trust us with that data, and they trust us with the story that we're going to tell with that data. When you look at the report today, it's definitely an evolution from what we saw in 2020. It's partly the same process, kind of first boiling the ocean. But we have the benefit today that we've been investing in through Atlantico for the past 4 years. We've been seeing those themes coming up past 4 years. So by the time that we start the report, I think we have a better sense of where to go with it. And then there's this entire ecosystem of partners that honestly just keeps growing every year.
We try to create amazing content and then we share it with our friends. And we reach out to people that have good reach on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on other social media. We say, hey, here's a report. Sometimes we give them a sneak peek and say, look, if you like what you see, pick out the slides that you like. And basically, we'd appreciate it if you share it. And people do. I think people like to share things that are interesting, that are insightful, and that's what we strive for in the content. And then kind of the rest takes care of itself. You sort of just need to put that initial spark, and then if things are good, they kind of go viral on their own. That was maybe what surprised us the most the first year, was just how much reach and how many people reached out and tweeted it and sent it on WhatsApp, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, et cetera. And I think every year we've seen that reach grow. And I think the types of people and the places in the world where the report gets to and the type of influence it has only growing with time.
What were some of the most curious types of influence or corners of the world that reports hit in the previous years?
I think for me, it's always interesting to see how our data or our analysis is used in the analysis or pitches of other people. I mean, as far as company pitches in Latin America that have incorporated something from our report, countless pitches. Here I'm talking about dozens and dozens. We've seen dozens of data rooms that, one of the documents in the data room is simply our report. The idea of, hey, let me try to educate international investors on what's going on in the region, and there's just a report. So you clearly see people using it as their canonical source for Latin American tech data. We've also seen a lot of public equity hedge funds, multi-billion-dollar hedge funds that have talked about the region and have heavily leaned on our research and our findings to make the pitch for why Latin America is where they should be deploying capital. I mean, we've seen this in China, we've seen it in the US, we've seen it in Europe. So you clearly see that this not only gets around the world, but it gets around to the right people. And I think the right people read it, and the right people use it then as a cornerstone for their own research and their own strategies.
You mentioned boiling the ocean, but I'm thinking it's just such a brilliant idea if you manage to do this report in a way that you did it, because if you don't even take the whole Latin America, if you take Brazil, which is 14 million population, all speaking Portuguese, very few high quality content is produced for those who do not understand the language. Like, you want to get to know the companies that thrive here, you can't if you don't speak the language. Most media, I mean, unless you are able to get on the TechCrunch, which obviously you are, and most of the companies that you backed are also, but unless you do that, you're covered by local media that do not have English version. So the demand for this type of information is just so high. And I feel like you guys are riding this demand opportunity and create the flywheel around the content. So I want to talk a little bit about the 2023 report that was just released in terms of key takeaways. So if each of you distill your main 5 to 10 takeaways from the report, what would those be for you?
I'm going to take this because it's an easy question, especially because you gave me 5 to 10. And the way that the report was organized this year was that the theme was really around tectonic shifts, is what we called it. And it was these large movements in the foundation of society and the economy and technology in Latin America that we think are creating these step function changes in different parts of society that can present huge opportunities. And we actually highlighted 5 tectonic changes, which is why I say it's easy to highlight 5 of them. And the first one was around Latin America being the engine of the world. And by that, we meant the fact that we both feed the world when you think about agricultural production, but we're also the mine of the world when you think about mineral production in particular that's going to fuel the clean energy transition. So the fact that we are rich in these commodities and that the demand for these commodities is expected to grow enormously over the next couple of decades could provide a huge tailwinds when you think about Latin America. And I think coupled on top of that, the fact that we're one of the regions when you think about Brazil and Chile to be first in the world to reduce interest rates now, I think a little bit of a reward for perhaps being one of the first to raise rates to fight inflation when it first started rearing its head. And I think finally, in this macro theme, also the fact that Latin America has been able to be a neutral player in this much more polarized world between China and the United States. And because of that win, both in terms of growing trade with China, but also huge benefits from moves towards nearshoring from the United States. So that's number one. Number two is what we called digital democratization. And the important thing here is to note that not only is Latin America world leading when it comes to usage of internet. You highlighted before that we're amongst the top 10 countries. When you think about all the different countries, Brazil, I think, is number 2 of hours spent on the internet. So we're very, very heavy users on the internet. And the population has access to the internet at nearly 80% of internet penetration, with many countries like Brazil or like Chile, like in the 85 to 90% levels of penetration, which is comparable to the United States and Europe. So not only are we all online, but the growth that has happened over the last 10 years as far as internet access has happened predominantly from the middle class going online and then also from lower income groups going online. So now, for the first time, the demographics of the online user and also the online banker and the online shopper, they finally reflect what the population and the economy looks like. And I think that has major implications for what it takes to win in the sector. So that was number 2. The third biggest point that we highlight is this renewal of the entrepreneurial spirit that we've seen over the last year. It's hard to argue that the last 18 months have been very challenging for entrepreneurs. I think everyone had to take the hard medicine, cut costs, extend runway to be able to adapt to a different funding environment that we have today. But I think that as venture funding has finally stabilized over the last 4 quarters in the region, and what I would argue at a fairly healthy level, and companies are now leaner and meaner and ready to increase their focus and run much faster, I think, towards their long-term vision. I think entrepreneurs finally see this renewed sense of optimism. Just to give you a sense, last year when we asked over 200 entrepreneurs how they were feeling, only 8% said that they were feeling optimistic. And entrepreneurs are famous for being irrationally optimistic, so 8% is basically as good as zero. Right. And this year, the 8% grew over 5x to 40 plus % of entrepreneurs saying they're optimistic. So that renewed energy and renewed spirit gives us a lot of hope for what's ahead. And we think that that optimism is very much warranted when you think about the potential for the value that we can create here in the region. Thinking about the next 10 to 20 years, we think that that value of technology companies is going to compound to things that are the high hundreds of billions of dollars of equity value creation if we catch up to a country like India, or even in the trillions of dollars of value creation if we catch up to the same levels of penetration that you have in China and the United States. And we think that's going to happen over the next couple of decades, and that's why we're excited to invest, and I think that's why we see entrepreneurs excited to build. The fourth theme or fourth tectonic shift that we think is shaping the region is the fact that money has truly gone super digital down here. We have now Pix, which is the instant payments rails that the Central Bank of Brazil has rolled out. That's now used on a daily basis twice as frequently as cash is.
What is that in terms of number of transactions, roughly?
I don't know what the numbers is, but it's billions of transactions. And to give you a sense, we've grown much, much faster in terms of transactions per capita than even, I think, UPI in India, which is long hailed as the example around the world of successful payments networks. You do see payments going fully digital on top of the Pix rails. You also see interactions with the financial system going fully digital. A full 95% of interactions that consumers or clients have with the financial system is now digital, down from 65% of them being physical or in person only a decade ago. So that has obviously huge implications for what's going to happen. And then the last one that I want to highlight. It was really around artificial intelligence. So what we think that this huge tectonic shift in the technology that's available today is going to have as far as impact in Latin America. We see that impact going all over the economy. We've seen it in advertising. We've seen it in growing efficiency. We've seen it in increasing service levels, but also in, I think, targeting a lot of the biggest needs that we have as a region. Access to high quality education, access to healthcare, the removal of red tape and reduction of bureaucracy. These are all challenges that we think are very realistic for artificial intelligence in this new wave that we're seeing to be able to tackle and help the region move forward.
It's probably what explains why such a substantial percentage of the population in Latin America is actually optimistic or super positive about the impact of AI, despite the AI would impact their jobs. That was some of the really curious finding from your report. For myself, so Anna, now you got a harder part. What are those for you?
Yeah, trying to think of the things that can truly surprise me. I'll start maybe in a backwards order from Julio, but on the artificial intelligence front, the rate of change was something that really surprised me. At the beginning of the year, we as a fund have been excited about artificial intelligence for quite a while. Julio, Ugo have been kind of working with founders in the space for almost a decade. And when we started to see this big step function change in the way that artificial intelligence is implemented, which was the launch of generative AI as a consumer product, we started to look more in-house and into the region to try to find people who were building in the space, people who were excited about the space. And turns out when you compared kind of Silicon Valley and even New York, but Silicon Valley at the top of that list and further from everyone else by an order of magnitude. In Latin America, you had very few people that were actually looking into experimenting with and deploying artificial intelligence in the beginning of the year. So we surveyed a lot of the tech founders, engineers, and CTOs that came to our AI events. We tried to create the space for people to come meet other people that were interested, learn more about artificial intelligence. And when we hosted an event earlier this year with Sam Altman, we surveyed everyone who came to the event. And only 50% of people were actually using very simple implementations of artificial intelligence, talking kind of GitHub Copilot, ChatGPT Copilot, and software development. And then when we look at things now, almost 6 months later, we've seen a huge uptick both within our portfolio companies, but we've also seen it in the data, the number of companies that are experimenting with and deploying with AI. The position within a tech company that most grew in terms of compensation was an artificial intelligence or machine learning engineer. So companies are really looking into the space, beginning to experiment with it. And we tried to highlight a few companies that actually already got results from it. So we highlight Clivi in Mexico. One of the big problems that we face in Latin America in healthcare is just the shortage of healthcare professionals, of doctors and nurses. And artificial intelligence has the potential to really increase the efficiency of these doctors. We talked about Letrus and Amira, how their artificial intelligence tools have really increased the reading comprehension ability and user engagement, student engagement with content. With Letrus specifically, their tool helped get Espírito Santo, one of the states here in Brazil, top of the list in terms of performance in Enem, which is our version of an SAT, I would say. And so I was really impressed with how much people picked up fast in this technology. And it goes to what you say. People are very pragmatic about it. They see that this is going to impact their day-to-day. It's going to impact their companies. It will impact their jobs nonetheless. And they're making the big moves to start implementing that. So that makes me excited for the next decade. And maybe the second one and the last piece of data that I'll highlight. So when we talked about money going digital, I've read so many articles about Pix. I think everyone in the world that has some interest in Latin America has read about Pix. And it's incredible. But I think very few pieces talk about why the reason that that's incredible is that when money truly goes digital in a region, you see a rate of change in both the formality of the economy. So the economy becomes more formal. People are able to access more financial services and in financial inclusion, because suddenly you have a huge portion of the population that was previously unbanked or underbanked that are in the financial system, that have credit data, that can now access services that were previously not available to them, beginning with credit, but also talking about investments, insurance, pension funds, right? So the cumulative good that that does for an economy is really incredible. And we're starting to see that in Brazil now. And we've started to see that actually 2 years ago. But we're really seeing that pick up as Pix actually surpasses cash in digital transactions. And then the big difference is that we haven't seen this yet in the rest of Latin America. When you look at Mexico, for example, cash payments still represent over 60%. And that has a huge correlation with the informality of the economy. If you've ever been to a small business in Mexico, been to an equivalent small business here in Brazil, you can see that the level of digitalization and financial inclusion is much lower in Mexico. And that's both concerning, but also a really big opportunity. There is big regulatory challenges in Mexico that need to be surpassed. There's a lot of barriers in terms of cultural adoption of technology that needs to be surpassed. But we're seeing that the movement of Pix in Brazil really inspired other countries in the region to start looking deeply to how to digitalize their economy and their money. And we've seen the Central Bank of Mexico learn from their experience with Cody, which was their version of Pix back in 2019, that didn't really take off, and create something that's actually more similar to Pix with a few nuances that are different for the Mexican environment, that is Demo, and that is launching now. We don't know if that's going to be successful, but I think the important thing is that both the government and the entrepreneurs in countries like Mexico, where the economy is not as digitized, are taking the steps to make sure that that happens over the next decade. And that's an exciting opportunity for us.
So, what do you think makes Pix so special? There is a number of great articles. The one that I read was in Financial Times that completely blew my mind. And I know that in the US and pretty much the whole world is learning from central bank and Pix in Brazil in terms of how do you digitize your cash operations. But what makes Pix stand out?
There are a couple of big things that the Central Bank of Brazil did incredibly well. Both the agenda for a real-time payment system, also the agenda for open banking, which eventually go hand in hand when you're talking about initiating payment transactions, but are two separate agendas that move towards the same goal of the digitalization of the economy. I hadn't really seen that work in any part of the world. I've seen real-time payment system work in India, although Pix was a lot more successful than UPI in both a absolute but also on a comparative basis. And then when we look at open banking agenda, we've seen that being tried in the UK, especially in other parts of Europe, and it never really worked in the way that we're seeing in Brazil. And I think a big part of that was one, there's an environment where the concentration of banking services is much higher. So back when central bank first started developing this agenda, concentration of financial services was 85% in the top 5 banks. What that means is if you're looking at implementing this in the United States, you're talking about convincing 1,000 banks to implement your system. Here, you need to convince 5. So the central bank worked very closely with these big financial institutions that made up 85% of most financial transactions. They made it mandatory for them to implement the rails of Pix within their operations. When we think about open banking, they made it so that you are a financial institution that does not engage in open banking inherently at a disadvantage. Because what it means is that every other financial institution around you has more data than you. So you created a huge incentive for these big financial institutions to push forward both agendas. And that made sure that it worked reaching the population in a way that we hadn't seen done before in other countries.
So, I have a couple more questions before we move to the rapid fire. And I think the most important question is how would you put the Latin American tech ecosystem and maybe Brazilian tech ecosystem specifically in the context of the large global tech ecosystems like the ones in US or China or maybe India in terms of how it compares? And it also, what do you think will make LATAM tech ecosystems globally competitive? What is the unique advantage, unique value proposition that local markets have that others don't?
I think that your question brings to mind a famous quote from one of my favorite science fiction writers, William Gibson. It says that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think that that's the way that we think about technology diffusion and penetration around the world, that the genie's out of the bottle when it comes to digitalization. It's not going to be the monopoly of the United States and Europe and China, but really everywhere in the world going to get digital. It's not a question of if, but it's a question of when. And I think that Latin America started later. I think the US started probably, I don't know, 20 years ahead of us when you really think about this big run up of technology. And China's probably 10 years ahead of us and India 5. So I don't think that entrepreneurs here or companies here leave anything to be desired. We just need to give time to time. Some of these things you just can't fast forward. And when we look back, we've seen exponential growth of technology value in the region for the last 20 years. We're still getting started. We're still very small, but we started from a small base that has been accelerating. And I think that the data also of the historical results leave us very optimistic, right? I think Latin America really punches above its weight when it comes to creating value. When you take a 1 point of comparison to India, which again is a country that started probably 5 years ahead of us as far as accessing venture capital, growth of technology companies. And you look at 5 or 6 years ago, India had something like 25 times the volume of venture capital on a percentage of GDP basis that Latin America had. So order of magnitude more venture capital than we did. And when you think about what we produced, we did a lot more with less. We produced more billion-dollar plus exits in the region. I think there were 12 $1 billion or plus IPOs and M&A exits in Latin America compared to 8 in India. And we created a lot more equity value. Over $80 billion of equity value created in Latin America compared to 60 some in India. So I think that history of being able to do more with less is going to serve us well when we think about the future and we start catching up. And I think it goes back to showing how competitive and how creative people here can be. And I think that as you start leveling the playing field, when it's access to human capital, access to financial capital, I think that we're going to be surprised at what we see going forward. We've definitely seen these companies that are national leaders and regional leaders. You have the maybe mega success of Nubank's IPO about a year and a half ago. Now it's, $1 billion plus publicly listed technology company in the US stock markets. And I think you're going to have over a dozen other companies out of Brazil predominantly going public in the US stock markets over the next 2 years. And it's names like iFood and Quinto Andar and Loft and Wildlife and many, many others, Gympass, Logica, all these companies are going to go public. And I think it's, again, going to shine a bright light on the quality of the companies coming out of here and the quality of the entrepreneurs. And I think that the next wave that we're also starting to see is that entrepreneurs from the region are starting to have more and more global ambitions. And they're not building just for their country. They're not building just for their region, but they're building for the world. And some of the names I mentioned, Gympass today, the company started out of Brazil, but the majority of its revenues, and certainly when it goes public, are going to be international. It's a new innovative business model going around the world. Vtex, which is an e-commerce enablement platform out of Rio de Janeiro, where we're sitting today. Again, US listed public tech company, which is nowadays growing predominantly abroad, serving international clients. I think if you look at Wildlife, one of the biggest gaming studios in the world, over 90% of its revenues are international. It's a company that was started globally from day one. And I think more and more you have entrepreneurs that see these role models and they try to emulate what they've been able to do. And I think we start taking more shots on goal as far as building large technology companies. And I think with some chance and some luck involved, many of these are going to become big global technology leaders.
Another thing that I've noticed about the local tech ecosystem here is LATAM's ability to actually soak the talent in. You mentioned Nubank, David Velez, he's not Brazilian. There are a bunch of other unicorns that are not founded by Brazilians, but the mentality and the culture and the opportunity that is presented here, it's just so welcoming. And this, I think, is really different from the culture of India or China, for example. It's really hard to build a business in India and China if you're not an Indian or Chinese. And I think in Latin America, it's perfectly doable. At least it was doable during this prior cycle of tech growth.
I think that the history of technology has shown that immigrants as a source for entrepreneurship is a huge tailwind. The United States is largely built by immigrants. And when you think about technology, a lot of the big US technology companies are built by immigrants, many of them Brazilians. If you take Instagram, which is one of the largest social platforms in the world. Mike Krieger is from Sao Paulo, one of the
Oh, I didn't know that.
If you take Brex, Enrique and Pedro are Brazilian. You have many other examples like that. And I think that the fact that Brazil has been able to welcome immigrants with open arms, and you have the founder of Nubank, Colombia, have our partners at Atlantico, Mate and Florian, who are German and Hungarian, who are the founders of Loft. There's a couple of other examples of immigrants that have come here to Brazil, I think enjoyed life here, have been welcomed with open arms, and have been able to build large global technology businesses.
If you close your eyes and imagine the next decade in Brazil and in Latin America, what are the key trends, the key forces, the key influences, and that could be anything from macro to tech to business, that the success, the continuous success of the tech ecosystem will be dependent upon?
We always talk about the forces that influence innovation in Latin America. When we talk about human capital, we talk about financial capital, and then about regulation. My perspective on this flywheel of development, that it starts with the human capital, and I think that that's going to be the biggest driver of change. And when we talk about these massive companies that are going global, a lot of them private, and that are starting to prepare for exits down the line, every time we see a successful exit like that, it attracts more talent to the region. It means that so much talent comes from those companies. A lot of them to start new companies. A lot of them become investors because they now have the capital from their exits to start reinvesting into the region in the way that Julio did. So I think when I think about next decade, human capital for me is always the biggest driving force.
Anna's right. I think we've also seen financial capital sticky right after this massive reset, a big drop, but you still have plenty of access to capital for new ventures, both domestic and international capital. So I think that that has shown to be very resilient. On the human capital side that Ana said, we conduct a research study every year with the top universities in Latin America. And we ask students where they want to go work. And consistently over the years, technology sector has been number one, ahead of going to work at Goldman Sachs in finance or McKinsey in consulting. When you think about the future talent, they want to be innovators and they want to work in technology, be it at startups or big tech companies. You have another big, strong tailwind coming from talent. And I think finally, regulation has been, by and large, I would say, pro-innovation. I think many of the governments of the region have seen innovation as a way to increase access in a very unequal society that we have today. They've seen it as a way to increase competition, with that being able to provide services that are better, faster, cheaper through technology for the population. And I think have largely allowed startups and technology companies to innovate. I think that's always a threat. The day that regulators maybe get a little overly active or overly eager to maybe control innovation, that can place some brakes in the speed at which we innovate. We, again, don't think that you can really hold these giant tectonic shifts and these forces of innovation, but you can certainly throw a lot of sand in the gears. And we hope that overzealous regulators are not going to do that.
Let's move to the rapid fire. This highly optimistic notes about the future of Latin America. I'll ask 5 short questions and I'll appreciate immediate responses. Most of the questions are for both of you, so whomever wants to take it. There are a couple of questions that I designed specifically. The first question is when you think about the great storytellers, who is the first person that comes to mind?
The first one that comes to mind for me is Scott Belsky, who's actually my co-founder in my last startup in the US. He's a great writer. Today he heads up product and a lot of the Adobe's work, and is just amazing with words, has published many great books, a great product and design thinker, someone that I think able to summarize things in a very succinct way and tell great stories.
You know who I thought about? I thought about Andy Dunn, who you introduced me to. If you're listening to this and you're a founder, you should definitely read Andy Dunn's book called Burn Rate, about how he built Bonobos, a hundreds of $1 million company in the US, having dealt with a lot of difficulty in mental health. And it's such an interesting story. It's well told, it's funny, it's entertaining. And he just tells it in a way that is so profound in terms of what you take from the story, but it's also so engaging. He's a great storyteller.
Julia, what's the next $1 billion business in Brazil nobody is building yet?
I think if I knew, I probably would be building it. But if I had to guess, I think that there's probably 2 areas that have a lot of promise. One of them is around agriculture. Depending on how you measure it, Agriculture is anywhere between 15 to 20% of the GDP of countries like Brazil. There is obviously more and more digitalization and software, but I think really just scratching the surface. We're still yet to see the killer app for agriculture. And I think that that's where maybe a world leading company can come out of Brazil.
Brazil is the world's what? Bread and butter, just like you guys mentioned in the report. Ana, you are one of the handful of female partners in venture capital industry in Brazil and Latin America. Very rare species so far. But what would be your 3 pieces of advice to women who are willing to break into the industry but just don't know how to get started?
Hopefully, it'll be less of a rare species in the future. I think number one, and the most important for me, is venture is a long term game, one that you only get good at with a lot of experience and a lot of time. You need to live through a full cycle. I haven't lived through a full cycle of venture yet. And the best way to learn is to learn from people who have. So the first piece of advice for me is find a mentor, find a team that's willing to teach you, to share their experience with you. And when you think about the investor that you want to be in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, you think of this team, you think of this person. And this either mentor or team, they need to be willing to open the doors for you because you don't just break down those doors by yourself. There needs to be kind of people who are respected in the ecosystem who can open those doors and who are really pushing for you to succeed. That's the biggest one of all. The second one is build your network, thinking of being we use this term a lot in Atlantico, which is long-term greedy. Don't build your network in a transactional basis. I think especially as a woman, it is so important to find other women in the business who are going to be by your side, who are going to support you, both in terms of the transactional part, which is exchanging deal flow, helping you with references, helping you with diligences, but also on the more relationship side, which is, hey, I had a hard day. Like, I lost this deal. I'm not feeling my best in terms of my investment judgment right now. How are you feeling? Find those people that are going to be with you for the long run, because again, it's a decade long or a multi-decade long game. And I think the third one is be patient. Regardless of whether or not you're a woman, if you're new to venture, it takes time to build your brand, your reputation, your network. It takes time for you to know if you've made good investment decisions. And sometimes you might have made a good investment decision, but you just had a bad outcome. So be patient, be resilient.
I love it. What are the 3 most common traits of failures that occur in tech businesses? Why do technology businesses fail, in other words?
A big one is that the founders just give up. I do think that resilience is an underappreciated trait of founders. And when I think the going gets tough, a lot of people throw in the towel. That's key one. I think that the other one, and this is one we've always tried to mitigate just from the stage at which we test post product market fit, is by avoiding companies that don't reach the first key milestone, which is hitting product market fit. I think if the dogs aren't eating the dog food, as they would say, and people aren't clamoring on your door to buy your product and your service, and you're seeing kind of that accelerating growth, then probably don't have something that you've built that really solves a need. And I think most companies, in fact, never get to product market fit. And I think that's just the nature of innovation and activity in technology, is trying to solve problems that no one has solved before. And there's a reason they've never been solved before, is that they're very hard. And then I think that maybe the last one is, I think for founders and leaders that don't think about kind of upscaling or supplementing themselves, I think it's all about the people and all about the team you bring around you. I think if you fail to bring people around you that are better than you, that it can kind of upscale the organization and take you to another level, I think that's often a quick road to failure. I think that having the humility to know that you're never going to be the best in the world at everything, and your role as a founder is to find the vision, communicate it, and then bring people on that bus that are going to help you get there. And those people have to be the best in the world at what they do, and your job is to guide them and be the glue between them. I think the failure to understand that and either try to do everything yourself or bring people that are at your level or below your level is another huge reason.
I should not ask follow-on questions, but I do have one follow-on question. With respect to the first bullet that you mentioned, which is the resiliency. sometimes you have to give up and pivot maybe, or give up and start something else. Not give up on your ambitions as an entrepreneur, but give up on this specific idea because there are chances that it will never work. So how do you know when you should give up versus how do you know that you should keep going?
I don't mean to say that you should never give up and I think see the writing on the wall when something's not going to work. And sometimes it's just not going to work, right? The vast majority of businesses don't work. I'll tell you my own personal story. My second company, Prefer, in the United States, we were trying to solve a very specific problem. Spent 3.5 years hitting our head against the wall, pivoting around, launching over a dozen different variations and approaches of product, and just, again, never got to product market fit. Like I mentioned, my companies die. And at some point, you come to the realization that you're just not going to solve the problem and you're out of steam, and the founder's out of steam, the team's out of steam, you're out of ideas. You've tried it for, in our case, years and have not succeeded. And at some point, it is time to kind of throw in the towel and say, look, let's move on. We weren't able to do it. We gave it our best shot and move on. It's not just kind of, let me keep doing this forever. But I think a lot of folks do maybe throw in the towel at the first signs of challenges. And I think finding the right balance definitely is difficult. I certainly struggle with it a lot, but I do think it's something that's critical and something that oftentimes hinders the success of business.
If you were to give a public talk on stage in front of the audience, but you could not talk about tech, venture capital, or actually anything directly related to your work today, what would you talk about?
It's a very random one. I told you I graduated in political science, right? And for 2 years, I worked with this incredible professor who did research around criminal governance in the favelas of Brazil. So how ungoverned spaces are run. We interviewed thousands of residents, of police officers, of criminal organizations, and I just became super passionate about that topic. And so in my free time, that's what I read about, that's what I watch, that's what I would give a speech about.
So what would you tell? Like, what are the highlights?
I think that an ungoverned space is very different country to country. But when you think about Brazil, the way that each small piece of land, each favela is governed is very different. And so the regulatory approach should also be very different. The policing approach should be very different, depending on who runs that small piece of an ungoverned space. And we as the population have a huge impact in that, in the way that we talk about people that reside in the favelas, in the way that the media talks about different policing strategies, in the way that we paint these people in the eyes of the population. And I think it's kind of an education process that is really lacking for the population here in Brazil. I think if I were to quit a venture today, that's what I would do with my life.
What would you do?
I think some of my hobbies outside of work are cooking and photography that I've always loved. And I don't know if I would give a lecture about it, but I would certainly give a class about it. I've long dreamt of having my own cooking show. I don't think I have really the personality for it, but I like to cook anything. I love to do the Iron Chef challenges of kind of give me 3 ingredients and let's try to come up with something to make. So that's maybe something that I would love to do that has nothing to do with what I do today. And photography is another thing that I've been passionate about. I took many classes, both in undergraduate and graduate school, and have worked as an amateur and photographer for different publications over the years. It's also something I would love to share my admiration for great photographers and great works that I've seen out there.
I'll give you 2 fun facts about Julio. He's invented 2 different cooking devices. One is a turkey baster that automatically bastes your Thanksgiving turkey while it's in the oven.
It's called a turkey shower.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I forgot the exact name of the gadget. And then the second one is a risotto mixer. What do you call that?
Stir, yeah. I always like kitchen gadgets as well. So I work with a mechanical engineer as a friend of mine, and we try to play around with some of these things in the kitchen, but it was, I think, more of a hobby and curiosity, even though I do think that the turkey shower was a great brand name.
Listen, I am unbelievably inspired by how multi-talented your team is, and also just observing the team dynamic, how complementary you are and supportive to each other. It's been such a blast. Thank you so much for sharing tons of information, tons of insights, and tons of your own personalities. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for having us. It was a lot of fun. I'm a big fan, so it's always good to be on a show that I admire.
Thank you.
Same here. I'm excited for you to come back to visit us in Rio.